is there good evidence for God? Essentially, what we've started with is I'm going to throw out everything that would normally be considered good evidence for reaching a conclusion. I'm going to deny your epistemology. I'm going to then insert an abductive argument because that's what will work best for the thing that I'm trying to argue for.
Welcome back, everyone. And if you are new here, genuinely glad you found this channel because today we have something special. So here is what is happening in this video. Matt Dillahunty, one of the sharpest atheist debaters out there, goes head to head with Tyler, a Christian presuppositionalist, over one of the biggest questions anyone can ask: is there actually good evidence for God? Not just evidence, good evidence. And the distinction matters more than you think. These two come at this from completely opposite directions, and what unfolds is one of those debates where the real fireworks are not in the shouting, they are in the logic. Stay with this one all the way through because the second half is where things get genuinely uncomfortable for one of these two men, and you do not want to miss the moment it happens. Also, before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now. It always blows me away how far this community reaches, and I love seeing where you all are coming from. All right, let us get into it.
I don't know how anyone could do this with a God, where we have no confirmed examples of a God ever doing anything. It's all inference. It's all unfalsifiable suspicions, appeals to ignorance or abstractions. So I'm not aware of any good evidence for God. I'm not aware of anyone demonstrating that there even could be good evidence for God or for anything supernatural. We don't have a mechanism by which we could explore supernatural causation or intervention. We don't get to just say, hey, we haven't found a natural explanation for it, so therefore my supernatural explanation is possible, plausible, likely, or proved. The entire history of apologetics is one of trying to mold arguments and evidence to the conclusion that someone has already reached, an attempt to prop up a God hypothesis that is ill-defined, malleable, and unfalsifiable. Is it more likely that we're desperately trying to ease our discomfort with not knowing, or that there is in fact a God who's playing an amazing game of hide and seek, playing favorites with private revelations, and staring at a world that has no coherent model of who that being actually is? If there were a God, that God should be able to easily provide good evidence. And by that, I mean evidence that nearly anyone would consider good evidence. We wouldn't have to have any discussion about whether or not, we're not going to be able to provide empirical evidence. We're not going to be able to provide material evidence. We're not going to be able to do this sort of testing. We wouldn't have to have an argument about what qualifies as good evidence. If there were, in fact, the kind of omni-God or the classical theism God that Tyler and others are advocating for, there would be no need for a debate. Suggesting that good evidence already exists is essentially suggesting that non-believers are a mix of unintelligent, dishonest, or delusional. And while that may be true for some, it certainly doesn't ring true in the larger sense, especially when you consider that the proponents of the purported good evidence gods don't seem to agree on what the evidence is, or what it means, or what God it points to, or the characteristics of that God. And many believers scoff at the very idea of providing evidence for a God and suggest that it's merely a faith-based position that cannot be proved. So while I was interested in hearing what Tyler would consider good evidence and whether we can come to some agreement on how good it is or isn't, it seems that we've started off with, hey, I'm not going to be providing anything that Matt or other people would actually consider good evidence because this thing is in a different category. And that's absolutely fine to say that it's in a different category, that it doesn't fit in with these particular rules. But then you have to come up with a mechanism by which you can show that the evidence you're presenting counts as evidence and not just inferences, because you want there to be some grounding or foundation for something that you haven't even demonstrated has one. Just that if it doesn't have one, oh no, we can't count it reliable. Because if God serves as the foundation for logic, and God can, as Tyler said, create these laws, then it would seem reasonable that God could then change these laws, which means there is no reliable grounding there either. That the only thing you have is confidence that, hey, there's a God as a foundation, and he's not going to change this stuff. And yet you still haven't done anything to demonstrate the subject of the debate, which is there good evidence for God? Essentially, what we've started with is I'm going to throw out everything that would normally be considered good evidence for reaching a conclusion. I'm going to deny your epistemology. I'm going to then insert an abductive argument because that's what will work best for the thing that I'm trying to argue for. And, this is why I think we may be stuck, because whether or not Tyler or somebody else accepts that, I cannot accept that as good evidence.
This is the moment where Matt Dillahunty stops playing defense and starts dismantling the entire foundation of the argument being made against him. And I need you to pay attention here, because what he does in this stretch is not just debating. It is exposing a pattern that has existed in theological argumentation for centuries. Matt said it plainly: it is all unfalsifiable suspicions, appeals to ignorance, or abstractions, and he is not aware of any good evidence for God. Now, before anyone jumps in the comments saying that is a bold claim, understand what Matt is actually pointing at. He is not saying God definitely does not exist. He is asking a much more precise question. Where is the confirmed mechanism? Where is even one demonstrated example of supernatural causation that we can actually investigate? Because in every other field of human understanding, we require that, every single one. And here is what blows my mind about this part. Matt makes a point that I think gets overlooked constantly in these debates. He says the entire history of apologetics, meaning the entire intellectual tradition of arguing for God, has been working backwards, starting with the conclusion and then building the case around it. Think about what that means. Imagine if a scientist said, I already know the answer, now let me find the data that supports it. We would immediately call that bad science. We would reject it. But somehow, when it comes to theology, that method gets dressed up in philosophical language and presented as serious intellectual work. Then Matt lands what I think is one of the sharpest observations of the whole debate. He says if there were actually a God of the kind Tyler is describing, all-knowing, all-powerful, the whole classical theism package, that God should be able to easily provide good evidence. Evidence that nearly anyone would consider good, not just philosophers, not just people who already believe, nearly anyone. And if that evidence existed, we would not be having this debate at all. Let that sit for a second, because what Matt is really saying is that the very existence of this debate is itself a piece of evidence. An all-powerful being who wants to be known and can make himself known. And yet, here we are, two people sitting across from each other arguing about whether there is even a standard for evidence. That tension does not resolve cleanly for the theistic position. And this is where it gets really sharp. Matt calls out Tyler's entire strategic approach in one breath. He says, what we have started with is, I am going to throw out everything that would normally be considered good evidence, deny your epistemology, and then insert an abductive argument, because that is what works best for what I am trying to argue. That is not a rebuttal. That is a diagnosis. Matt is naming the game being played. And Tyler does not refute it.
You bet. Thank you very much, Matt, for that opening statement. Now we will go into the 60 minutes of open conversation, setting a timer just to be sure we stick with that 60 minutes, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So, gentlemen, thanks so much again for being here, and the floor is yours.
You want to start? Or
yeah, sure. A couple thoughts. I mean, I was trying to frantically write down as much as I could, because there was a lot of I don't mean this in a bad way. There was a lot of kind of scattered thoughts that I'm not sure I heard an actual argument all the way through. The first half, I'm not sure I really disagreed with much, besides the implication that you wanted to draw from it of a kind of logical positivist empiricism. The use of logical fallacies and reasoning and all. There's not much that I disagreed with. What you're doing is, what it seems to me that you're doing is kind of like playing. I don't mean this pejoratively. It's kind of like playing fetch with the dog, where you throw a ball, the dog gets the ball, and I'm saying, okay, I threw the ball, and you're saying, but that's the ball, and I say, great, but I threw you the ball, and you say, but that's the ball, and I say, great, but but I threw you the ball, right? So you're pointing to that common ground of reasoning and logic in the process. And my argument is, okay, that's all well and great. That's the common ground I conceded. The question is, what is the possible foundation for those? And are they true? I'm hoping you're interested in what's true and not merely what's pragmatic.
Yeah. So, and so this is why, and I took a bunch of notes while you were talking. We're in agreement. Let's just say we're in agreement that we'll just stick with identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle as the foundations of reason. The thing that I'm not convinced is that anyone has demonstrated that there is or could be some justification or some foundation behind that, because you'd have to show that this isn't just the way things are. And I understand that it would be nice to say, we have shown that this is an inviolate foundation. I just don't see how we can actually get there, because one of those things where you would have to assume they were true in order to use them in the first place. And so rather you're taking an extra step and saying, I think we have described something that is, these transcendents must exist in a timeless, spaceless realm. Well, that is a step further than I can go, because I don't look at them as extant things or don't see the need to create a separate realm. Because imagine there was nothing. Hey, I realize this is incredibly difficult. Now we're going into universe from nothing crap, which I'm not going to do. But those things would still be true, because nothing is nothing. It's not nothing, and everything is either nothing or not nothing. Those things would also be true in any realm that I could imagine, and they seem to be true whether or not there is a God. And so the curious thing is that if you think that God can create these laws of logic, can God change them?
Yeah. So I think, let me try to help. I think there might be a slight misunderstanding in how you're understanding not only the concepts that we're dealing with, but the argument that's being made. Because you said a couple of things like, oh, well, you basically cast the argument as, well, I don't know, so therefore it'd be really nice if God was there, which wasn't the argument that I made at all. That type of psychologizing,
you repeatedly dismissed the notion that it was okay to say I don't know, which I object.
I didn't dismiss. I didn't dismiss it. It's okay to say I don't know. That's why I even gave the example that it might be permissible for you to remain a skeptic. That might be very good. But for someone who has a robust argument and evidence for something, your incredulity about something is not a defeater for it. Right? You might remain.
I'm wondering what the actual evidence is. But you said God can create these laws.
You have to understand what is happening at this point in the debate, because the dynamic has completely shifted. Tyler is no longer on offense. He is trying to explain himself, and the moment a debater starts spending more energy clarifying what they meant than advancing their argument, that tells you something. Matt holds his ground and says something that I think is genuinely underappreciated as a philosophical point. He says the thing he is not convinced of is that anyone has actually demonstrated that the laws of logic require a justification or foundation at all. Read that again. He is not saying the laws of logic are wrong. He is not dismissing logic. He is saying, show me the demonstration that a foundation is even necessary before you start building a skyscraper of theology on top of that assumption. This is actually a really important distinction that gets lost in these conversations. In philosophy, there is a long-standing debate about what are called foundationalist versus coherentist approaches to knowledge. Foundationalism says knowledge needs a base, a set of basic beliefs that everything else is built on. Coherentism says beliefs can justify each other in a web without needing a single unmovable foundation. Matt is essentially challenging whether Tyler has even earned the right to demand a foundation before the conversation can proceed, and that challenge never gets properly answered. But the moment that really stops the debate cold, and I mean the room genuinely pauses here, is when Matt asks Tyler directly, if you think God can create the laws of logic, Can God change them? That is such a precise trap because it works both ways. If God can change the laws of logic, then they are not reliable, and the whole argument collapses. If God cannot change them, then the laws of logic exist independently of God, and they no longer need God as their foundation. Tyler cannot escape either side of that. And what does Tyler do? He says he may have misspoken. Matt immediately says, "No, I wrote it down as you said it. God can create these laws. Those are your words." And this is where the mask comes off a little. Because when someone is forced to say, maybe I misspoke in the middle of defending a carefully constructed philosophical argument, that is not a minor slip. That is the argument developing a crack right at its load-bearing wall.
No.
You did. I wrote it down as you said it. God can create these laws.
No, actually, I said that God can create the universe that coheres to those laws. I hold it as I'm an idealist, right? I think
maybe I misspoke. Maybe I misspoke. Maybe I misheard. Whatever.
Yeah.
But
So
I wrote that down because it seemed really strange
Yep.
that someone would say God can create these laws because that suggests that he can change them.
right.
But if God can't change them, then he's bound by them, which means they transcend God.
No, because if this is where I want to back up.
Okay.
Right, because you properly said, and I get that's why I said in my own, let's ignore the semantics of saying nothing exists. we all get the problems with that.
Yeah, you and I both agree that's silly.
Yeah. But I know what you mean. This is where I was bringing up Nagel, right? Nagel was pointing out, well, natural explanations naturalism just fails epistemologically to ground all these transcendental facts of reality. It just categorically does not work for any of them, right? There's an atheist philosopher arguing this, and he's been pretty successful in defending that. And he goes on to say basically what you did, which is, well, they'd be true even if nothing existed, right? Which is why he's stuck saying, and I was interested to hear you admit that, because that effectively is, I think, whether you're comfortable with it or not, that effectively is that kind of that non-theistic Neoplatonism, where you have this realm, quote unquote realm. It's not a spatial place or anything like that, of these abstractions that just exist as truths. They just exist as these propositional abstractions. But in Neoplatonism, the question that I have, and one of the arguments that I made for why it's true, remember, I'm not just saying, well, we don't know, therefore God. The argument is, we know what it means for these conceptions to be true as concepts in minds. We 100% know what that means in 100% of analogous situations. We know what it means for these to exist abstractly in minds. It's conceptually incoherent to say that they simply exist, that the law of non-contradiction just exists in and of itself.
So first of all, I have a problem when we start saying exists, because I view these as descriptives and not prescriptives. They are a description of the way things are. The issue that I have is, while we have an understanding of them, I don't see that we have an understanding of whether or not they require some foundation, or what that foundation could be, or why. Because if all we're saying, it's like saying, and we'll ignore the semantic portion of this. In base 10, what we mean by 2 + 2 = 4 is true. It doesn't mean that math requires some grounding or foundation, something to guarantee that this is inviolate. As a matter of fact, math is deductively derived from identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. That's as far back of a foundation as we can possibly get. And so the very notion that these could be otherwise seems absurd.
This is where Matt finishes the thought. And honestly, it's one of the cleaner pieces of reasoning you will hear in a debate like this. Matt says, the laws of logic are a description of the way things are, not a prescription, not a rule handed down from somewhere, a description. And then he does something really elegant. He points to mathematics. He says in base 10, what we mean by 2 + 2 = 4 is true. And that does not mean math requires some external grounding or foundation to guarantee it. Math is deductively derived from identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. Those three things. That is as far back as the foundation goes. Now, why does that matter so much? Because Tyler's entire argument rests on the idea that these logical and mathematical truths need something behind them to guarantee they work. Some timeless, spaceless, immaterial mind holding them in place. But Matt is pointing out that the moment you understand what these things actually are, descriptions, not objects, not entities floating in some abstract realm, the demand for a cosmic guarantor simply dissolves. You do not need someone to hold up the fact that nothing can both exist and not exist at the same time. That is just what existence means. And here is what I find genuinely fascinating about where this debate lands. Tyler came in with a very sophisticated philosophical framework, transcendental arguments, abductive reasoning, references to Thomas Nagel. This was not a lightweight presentation, but sophistication is not the same as soundness. Matt's approach throughout this entire segment was not to out-philosophize Tyler. It was to keep asking the most basic question. Has anyone actually demonstrated that this needs an explanation beyond what we already have? And that question never got a satisfying answer. That to me is the real takeaway. You can build an incredibly elaborate argument. You can use every philosophical tool available. But if the foundation of your argument assumes the very thing you are trying to prove, that these features of reality require a God-level explanation, then no amount of sophistication fixes that problem. Matt knew that, and he stayed on it the entire time. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.